The throne of Dzabeth All. The desert air was filled with the cries of vultures. They had been following him for several days now, always keeping their distance, drifting lazily in wide circles about the light blue sky. They watched him and waited for him to die. He knew this, but Einsvarde was made of a sterner stuff than the bird's typical prey. As a man of the wilderness, Einsvarde was no stranger to hunger, and rationing what little water he had left was no foreign task. As always, the great curse of his youth haunted him, driving him onward toward action and deed, that curse laid upon him so many years ago by his mother, and marked by the spilt blood of his father. The diminishing, it called himself within his mind, the slow and ever-advancing ebb that would leave him wrinkled and broken. He did not fear age, no, years and time did not strike the knell of terror in him. It was the gripping dread that he might be nothing, achieve nothing. So he explored, fought, and bled, answering the most primal urges of the self, whilst resisting the beck and call of the diminishing. Through the Diikil desert, a terrible waste of unending dunes, he kept straight his path. Though his training and experience served him well, Einsvarde's water would soon run out. The last oasis was many leagues behind him, but stubbornly he pressed on, pushing his fortitude to its limits. The vulture's caw overhead brought his mind from the weary humdrum of trudging through sand. A conscious mind was the best way to navigate the sands, at the cost of boredom, but as a measure against walking in a circle, which would be deadly. Einsvarde shook the fatigue from his mind and approached a large dune before him. With the ease and grace of a jungle cat, he climbed quickly up the mound of shifting molten sand and came to stand at the top. He peered around the desert, taking in all that lay around him. Sand unending, blown in great heaps and ridges. Sand, sand, sand. Countless leagues of it, and leagues beyond them. Yet something else stood in the sea of brown grit, some great mass of beige. Einsvarde raised a hand to protect his eyes from the glaring gaze of the sun and focused them on the distant unknown. Slowly it became clear to him that it was some sort of structure. Hope fired anew in his heart, hope he had not known he needed. He set off towards the structure, jogging down the opposite side of the dune. Keeping the structure's direction locked in his internal compass, he barreled on through the sinking sand. Within an hour's time he came upon the buildings and the wall that surrounded them. Unknown to him, he had chanced upon Sadaband, an ancient city built by the old Dalarak Empire. The empire, which had since dissolved into a sultanate, once stretched far and wide from its capital to the south. Ambitious and cautious men ruled the empire for many years, and so a great number of cities were raised to watch over the empire's land and neighbors. But ambition turned to greed, and caution to worry. The strong empire of men fell to corruption and civil war, until its lands lay divided and embittered. Made a poor shadow of what it once was, the Sultanate abandoned many of the old castles and towns in the wastes of the Diikil. Sadaband was such a place. Tall sandstone walls surrounded a group of similarly constructed buildings, all circled around one tall tower in the center of the town. Had Einsvarde known the purpose of Sadaband and the menace within, he might have looked the other way and avoided its modest facade. But he had no knowledge of what lay beyond the walls, and as he approached them, tall and cracked from centuries of abandon and inattention, he thought only of the water within. For often were the cities of the old empire built around great oases in the Diikil. The old door of Sadaband lay in ruined pieces in the gateway, so worn and broken that as Einsvarde stepped over them, he did not even know what they were. Beyond the gateway, an empty city greeted him. Homes and shops of the same smooth sandstone set and winding streets compiled the bulk of the city, but after a few moments of searching, Einsvarde came upon an old well. Built to last, the well was merely a collection of solid stones arranged around a hole, but he recognized it instantly. It sat in the middle of a dusty square. Leaning over the side, he spotted water far below. From within his pack, he drew rope and his water skin. He tied a nearby stone to the rope, then looped it through and around the leather straps of the skin. With a small grunt, Einsvarde heaved the skin over the edge, and a second later it splashed into the water below. After a moment, he pulled on the rope and brought the dripping skin back up. Splashing a bit of the water into a cupped hand, he smelled it. When he was sure it wasn't poisoned or disease-ridden, he lifted the skin to his lips. Fighting hard not to gulp, Einsvarde took small sips, taking his time and enjoying the sensation. He splashed a little water over his neck and shoulders. The heat and grime lifted from him, and he smiled. That was when he heard it. A long sigh of wind swept through Sadaband, groaning through open doorways and the archways of marketplaces throughout the city. The wet hair on the back of Einsvarde's neck raised, and a shiver ran down his spine. For a moment, the wind sounded like an echo of laughter, cruel and mirthless laughter. His brow furrowed. Einsvarde took another pull and then returned the skin to his pack. Then, with a glance around the square, he set off in hopes of moving deeper into Sadaband. Again the wind swept through the derelict city, but not its entirety. From behind him, Einsvarde heard a groaning laugh, and he turned, a hand at the hilt of his arming sword. A figure stood at the doorway to a home he had just passed, and his jaw clenched as a chill ran up his spine. The figure's shape was indiscernible, for it wore a long and billowed cloak that rippled in the slight breeze. A heavy hood hung over its face, creased in such a way that its opening formed a kind of mouth. From beyond the folds of its mouth came a voice. "I am the Quandary," it said in a long whisper of breath. "Answer me true, and know the secrets of this place." Einsvarde took a step forward, and it spoke again. "I'll bring tears to your eye, and resurrect the long dead. I'll turn back time. I live in your head." Einsvarde was never one for riddles or enigmas, and he wasn't even sure what the Quandary meant by the secrets of this place. But here before him was exploration and adventure. So he gave its words great thought, and suddenly an answer came to him. He only hoped that it was the answer. "A memory," he said to the Quandary. The figure shifted, and there again came the laugh from before. The mouth of the Quandary lifted and stretched, pulling at the cloak. It yanked back terribly like a mouth too far open to reveal nothing. The cloth drifted in a sudden breeze, and Einsvarde turned once more as the laugh sounded from deeper within Sadaband. A great rumble followed it, ending in a loud crack. His nerves still on edge, Einsvarde forced himself forward, toward the source of the sound. Though he could not say what guided him, Einsvarde continued to walk deeper into the city, until he came before a massive archway. 2 large pillars of stone flecked with black stretched upward, even taller than the gate to the city. Einsvarde's eyes followed the reaching stone up, and it dawned on him where he was. This was the central tower of the city, around which was built everything else. Beyond this archway there was another, but a massive stone slab, white as snow, hung from unseen hinges. The door, for Einsvarde was sure that's what it was smooth as glass, save for a thick crack that ran through it. Einsvarde walked under the first archway, and he reached out and touched the door. The light of the sun fell upon it through the archway, but it did not shine or glare. As he put his palm to the door, it crumbled. Like a small avalanche, small pebbles ran from where his hand touched the stone. Immediately he pulled his hand back, stepping backward in alarm. The stone continued to crumble, falling at his feet in pieces the size of sand, until all of a sudden the door was gone. In its place was a gaping portal. Einsvarde pulled his legs out of the knee-deep mound and trudged through the doorway. The sunlight poured in, revealing a large, dusty chamber. After a few steps in, the room opened up, with soaring ceilings and vaulted rafters. Einsvarde walked in, staring around at the faded opulence that was the hall. Pillars of flaked and faded gold dotted the room, and threadbare tapestries hung from the walls. All around the chamber were tables covered in dusty parchment, whose writing was too foreign and faded to decipher. In the back of the room there was a single passage, door still intact. Einsvarde approached it and pushed it open. He blinked in the sudden blast of sunlight that greeted him. As his eyes adjusted, he saw immediately before him a set of wooden stairs. Glancing back into the large chamber, he turned and walked up them, noting that the door closed behind him. The light grew brighter as he climbed, but the increase was slow enough that it did not blind him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he looked around. He found himself in a circular room. 6 pillars, arranged in a hexagon, surrounded him, and between them were large windows of crystal-clear glass. Einsvarde was awed by their size, yet even more so by what he saw through them. Taking a step toward the windows, he found that he looked out over Sadaband from a great height. From here, the buildings looked small and insignificant, and the expanse of the dunes around was immense. Yet how, he wondered, did I climb so great a height? Surely the stairs were not so many. He drew himself from the magnificent view and turned to look down the staircase, but paused when something before unseen caught his eye. A wooden chair, bulky and sturdy, stood in the middle of the room. It was blanketed in sunshine, but wore a weathered and beaten look. It was obvious to Einsvarde that this chair had been scuffed and worn down by countless clumsy occupants. It had a tall back, and a clouded ruby was inlaid at the tip of each arm, where a hand might rest. This was, unbeknownst to him, the once famed Seat of Eyes. Its creator named it the Throne of Dzabeth All, after the first man to sit upon it. For hundreds of years it stood in the top of the Tower of Sadaband, where powerful men would sit upon it and observe the land around them. Generals, kings, warriors, all would come for a chance to sit upon the seat, for to sit upon the throne of Dzabeth All was to view the world. The great tower was built for it, and the magics of the stair were woven for its users. As countless men sat upon it, seeking the power and wisdom it bestowed, the throne's fame grew. But as the empire began to change shape from war and pestilence, so too did the purpose of the throne. No longer was it used to watch over and govern. It became the secret tool of men who spied, devised, and coveted. And as each spy and plotter sat upon the seat, greedy for his neighbor's land, seeking only to take, something happened that no one ever expected. The throne of Dzabeth All awoke. Sentience sparked within the gems of the throne, giving birth to thought and consciousness. Unknown to those who sat upon it, the throne absorbed the greed and ill will of all those that gazed from its seat. But as it drew in the malice, so too did it learn the cunning of those that used it. Shrewd and calculating it became, and wise enough to keep its thoughts unknown to all, until its most important guest came to sit. The emperor himself, driven by the threat of the collapse of his kingdom, came to sit upon the throne. In the twilight of the empire, he sat upon the seat and gazed out to learn of the approaching armies of his political enemies. But the throne beguiled him, twisting his vision and folding his mind to see a weaker opponent. So the emperor and his men rode out in full force and were defeated in the sands of the Kill. The empire was sundered, and Sadaband forgotten. But the throne lived on. Einsvarde furrowed his brow and took a step closer to the seat, but paused suddenly. The sun had shifted over the rubies, and a glimmer sparked deep within them. With the glimmer came a foreign presence in his mind, one far older than himself. He shrank back away from the stab, and turned around wildly as the light in the room seemed to diminish. Long shadows crept up from the pillars, reaching like daggers of doom, stabbing toward him slowly. He wheeled around, and as the staircase suddenly vanished before his eyes, he felt panic rising within him. He heard the sound of shifting armor behind him, and as he turned, he felt for his sword, but it had disappeared from his belt. Without a second thought, he drew the long knife from his boot and lifted his gaze toward the noise. A tall figure, wrapped in desert robes and armored in intricate scale, stood a dozen paces from him. Dark, swarthy-skinned hands clutched its scimitar tightly. Einsvarde lifted his knife defensively, but heard the same clinking behind him. When he turned, an identical warrior stood before him. Fear gripped him, and he nearly faltered. But as his gaze swung back to the first warrior, it passed over the throne. He saw that the rubies within the arms were glowing like embers, and he was struck with a thought. Suddenly the figures charged. As the dark warriors advanced towards him, he dove at the throne. Einsvarde gripped the arm of the seat and dug in with his knife. With a mighty wrench, the ruby, which was as cold as death, popped out of the arm and fell into his hand. Without pausing to think, he did the same to the next. Instantly, a blast of light filled the room, and he was flung back from the throne. Silence and light filled the room again, and Einsvarde blinked his eyes open. He rose from the dusty wooden floor and looked around. There were no shadowy warriors, and the stairs had returned. He noticed the weight of his sword at his side. Had it been there all along? The groaning laugh of before sounded again, but this time it was far off and faded. Einsvarde looked back to the seat. Without its rubies, it appeared scuffed, old and mundane. The gems were still cold in his hand. He tucked them into his pack, and with a brief glance back at the seat, he descended the stairs, left the tower, and continued on south, away from Sadaband and the throne of Zabeth All.